So, do you ever feel overwhelmed with just trying to keep up with everything that's going on in the world right now? I know I do. I mean, there's only like two active wars, China threatening Taiwan, and the most contentious presidential election in our history coming up. Now, I've been looking around for someone who could give me some perspective on this, and I was put in contact with a gentleman named David Pyne. Now, David's resume is impressive. Here are some of the highlights. He has served in the U.S. Army, studied national security at Georgetown, political science at BYU, was a former state Senate candidate, was National Security Policy Director for Senator Mike Lee, and finally Defense and Foreign Policy Advisor for former presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. So you may not always agree with some of his takes and what he has to say, but I believe his analysis deserves at least some consideration. We cover everything from the roots of the conflict in Russia and Ukraine to China's desire to control Taiwan, and finally we wrap up with what you and your family can do to prepare for some of these times coming up. That and more on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. So a few weeks back, I told you about a new online merch store I was putting together and that I would let you know as soon as that was up and running. Well, after a few weeks of working on designs and testing it out personally, we're ready to launch. So if you go to MormonRenegade.com and click on the Renegade Supply button in the top right of the landing page, or click the link in this episode's show notes, you'll see that we have 16 items right now that you can choose from. We have shirts, hats, bags, cups, and water bottles, all with the Mormon Renegade logo, as well as a couple other designs that I think you'll find really funny. And maybe even one where I take a slight shot at BYU, but you should definitely go check that out. Now, this is just the beginning. In the coming weeks, more designs and styles will be available for purchase. Now, all the proceeds I get from this are going to go right back into the podcast. So head on over to MormonRenegade.com and press the Renegade Supply button, or click the link in this episode's show notes and get yours today. David, thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure being on the show. Thanks for inviting me.
Perfect. So, real quick, David, what is your background exactly?
So I'm a former U.S. Army officer, also an attorney, and I did some time on the U.S. Army headquarters staff about 20 years ago in D.C. I was stationed at the Pentagon, 2 miles from the Pentagon in Roslyn, when September 11th happened. So
Wow.
that caused, I mean, it was pretty crazy time to be in, in the area, 2 miles from the strike. And our headquarters office got burnt out. Our general, our major general escaped, but all his stuff was lost. And I was in charge of R&D, armaments cooperation with most of the regions of the world, but it was the regions of the world that we didn't do a lot with: the former Soviet Union, Middle East, Americas, Africa. Not Western Europe. Western Europe, we had way more stuff going on, but I had Eastern Europe as well. And so I obviously had classified access at that point. And while I was serving that capacity, and it was out of uniform, by the way, I'd already left the service. I had a major beef with Bush's plan to invade Iraq. And so I published 10 to 12 articles against his war plan. And he had one of his political appointees try to prosecute me and imprison me. And I was able to escape that. But because I wasn't in the Army, the charge was like disgracing the Army because I dared disagree on matters of national security with the president's war plan. And we hadn't even invaded Iraq up till that point, but I was essentially dismissed 5 days before we invaded, and I mean, I've never looked back. I've always wanted to choose peace over war. I mean, having studied war my whole life since I was 11, really, so over 4 decades. And that's why I decided to set up this website, also to serve as executive vice president of the Task Force on National Homeland Security. I've run for state senate and lower offices. I would have won my state senate race, but I decided to drop out and move to Utah. I was in New Mexico at the time. But yeah, I'm always trying to make a difference. I've written a lot. I was a co-author of a book recently. I'm working on being a co-author of another book with our president and CEO in the Task Force on National Homeland Security. Um, but yeah, just trying to make a difference for good.
Man, you were like way ahead of the curve as far as conservatives, right? Which I consider myself a conservative, but standing up in those days and saying, maybe we shouldn't do this with the whole invading Iraq thing, that shows a lot of intestinal fortitude, brother. Because in those days it was a different world than today, right? How,
Yeah,
what
it was very much a minority opinion. I mean, the political scientists, the people that actually were educated on foreign policy, were pretty opposed to it, like a majority. There were like 12, I counted 12 former 3 and 4 star generals that opposed the war. Maybe it was 8 to 12. But I mean, all the politicians, I mean, there were like 6 Republicans that voted against the authorization of the use of force in Iraq. It was an unprovoked attack on a country that created a genocide that killed or ethnically cleansed 1 million Christians. And yeah, I mean, I'm so focused on just war theory. That's what I got trained on as a Army cadet at BYU ROTC back in the late 80s. It was all about morality and war. I'm so sick of people hearing that claiming that there's no morality in war. You can kill whoever you want, bomb the crap out of them. If you're Israel, you get to kill tens of thousands of innocent civilians. It's okay if the U.S. does it. We can atomic bomb Japan, but if Russia invades Ukraine to try to defend itself from NATO imperialism, then they're the second coming of Adolf. Who's the second coming of Adolf Hitler? There's so much disinformation and lies about U.S. history, and I'm a patriot. I love my country, even though I think we did a lot of bad stuff, mainly in World War II. But yeah, just trying to make it better.
Wow. Wow. So when you get out of the sounds like government altogether, right? You immediately, I shouldn't say immediately, you end up becoming an author and a writer. How long is it before you realize that, you know what, writing this ship? Because I remember after 9/11 thinking, okay, things will go back to normal, right? Like my my friend Mason on here who helps me out, he's probably never lived in a time like I did, where I could literally go to the airport like a half hour before I gotta be on my flight and be just fine. And so I was waiting for those days to come back, and it became pretty apparent after about a year that it wasn't coming back. Was there ever that moment of realization for you after 9/11 that hey, we've crossed a bridge, so to speak, and things aren't going to go back to the way they were?
Yeah, so I had a couple of, I mean, I had 3 very young daughters at the time, and well, I guess 2.5, 2.5 on 911. But anyway, we went to California. We lived in Virginia, Northern Virginia. We went to California to visit my parents, and I think it was on the way there. Like, I actually had to get 1 or 2 of my baby girls out, and they had to swab their feet, or I think it was maybe on the way back from California to Virginia, probably going to Reagan National, and they swabbed their feet for explosives. And I was thinking, the U.S. is the most idiotic country in the world. Israel has it, they have it down smart. They don't racially profile, they criminal profile. It just so happens that most terrorists are, of Arab origin, or were at the time. There weren't any white type people that were, white Europeans that were involved in the 9/11 bombing. But, grandmas, former vice presidents were being pulled over, security checked, all because, we can't discriminate. We can't criminally profile. So everyone pays the price, and that was kind of, well, obviously the bigger realization that we were in having, the security state was when I was they were trying, I had a colonel, a JAG colonel that interviewed me, and he's like, do you want an attorney present? I'm like, no. Why? They haven't done anything wrong. I've, because I viewed myself as I was defending the United States Army. I love the Army. I was only in for 3 years, but I was also on the headquarters staff for 3 years once I was out of uniform. And I was all about protecting the troops, making sure their lives weren't wasted in fruitless wars, wars of aggression, whatever the case might be. And, so I wasn't worried about, maybe I should have been, because as we see, with Trump, you can do, I mean, obviously he hasn't done anything right, but he hasn't done anything wrong.
Right.
At least, maybe he's been unethical in certain ways at some points in his past, business wise or otherwise, but not, he hasn't committed any crimes. And, he's been prosecuted with 91 felonies. And obviously we weren't quite to that extent back then, where you could be thrown in prison if you were, a 75-year-old grandma that showed up at the Capitol and didn't even enter
Right.
the Capitol building, and you can go to jail for 2 years. So we hadn't been Sovietized at that point, but that was kind of a rude awakening, I think, for me.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, man, you've lived a life already. That's impressive. So, and thanks for what you did in the Army. I mean, and thanks for what you do now. I feel like it's important. When I started checking you out, I noticed that you've started to really bang the drum hard on a coming war between us, Russia, and China. What leads you to believe that?
Well, I mean, I've been, when President Biden was elected, and I say elected in quotes because, he was elected by the Electoral College, but he, stole the election essentially. 6 million votes. President Trump obviously won the majority of the votes and legal votes in the battleground states. But he was duly elected by the Electoral College, and once he was elected, I posted, I think that it's very likely that the U.S. will not survive Biden's first term. And I was absolutely serious, and I think I've been proven. I mean, the reasons for me to believe that have certainly increased. I've condemned his policy in Ukraine as a policy of national suicide, because I think the more we escalate against Russia, the greater the chance that Biden will or Putin will attack us catastrophically, most likely with a massive cyber attack. Could also be a super EMP attack or even limited nuclear strike. And at the same time, Biden has stated 4 times in a row that we would defend Taiwan militarily against China, which is surprising because he's essentially a CCP controlled asset. But at least the last statement he made just this past week, he actually kind of returned us to a policy of strategic ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
But given his mental faculties or lack thereof, I mean, he could switch us back on a dime. But at least his latest statement did not commit to go to war with China, because my estimate is China is likely to invade or blockade Taiwan in October. And I don't think Biden's going to deliberately get us into war, but I can see just how all of his stupid policies, he could bring our ships really close to the blockade line, and that there could be an accidental exchange of fire, some downed planes hit ships, and then that could just escalate to a massive cyber attack on the U.S. and then our country's over essentially.
Whew. So you're as bad as hopeful as I am. That's impressive. Real quick, what were the conditions on the ground that led to Russia invading Ukraine? right? Because we get the
So this
narrative,
could,
that you know what, it's this bigger country and it just wants to beat up on this little country. And I'm not saying Putin's a great guy, right? I don't say that, but nothing happens inside of a vacuum, right? So what is it that what are the conditions that basically Putin's like, well, I got to go take it over? What's going on there?
so it started with this crazy idea that from George W. Bush, who I consider one of our absolute worst presidents in American history, certainly in modern history. He was awful on every national security issue, whether it's war or nuclear disarmament or whatever the case might be. But it, he decided to pressure NATO to issue a declaration called the Budapest Declaration, or the Bucharest Declaration of 2008. That was in, I think it was April, and it basically stated Ukraine and Georgia are joining NATO. We don't have a timeline, but they will be NATO members in the near future. And Putin had already identified that as a red line. He'd given a speech the year before and said, he had been super pro West up to that point, and he wanted to join NATO. He'd asked Russia to join NATO twice in 2000, 2002. He was trying to get Russia to join the EU, essentially be, perhaps not as an EU member, but essentially have this economic integration with Europe. And that was really the turning point. And Russia, after that, Russia invaded northern Georgia because Georgia attacked some Russian separatist areas where Russian troops were stationed. And so he responded, but he didn't respond by, occupying Tbilisi, which is the Georgian capital. And then in 2010, there was a pro-Russian president who was elected, President Yanukovych. And 4 years later, Biden authorized a coup that overthrew the democratically elected president because he decided to stay out of the EU and to have Ukraine not become a Russian ally or even part of the Russian Eurasian Union, which is Russian led, but simply to become a neutral country and to give up the previous president's decision to try to move towards NATO membership. And that was kind of that was something that the U.S. is always pushing ever since 1945. It's been trying to expand its global empire. And certainly there was a national security reason for that, at least in Europe. I mean, because we were at that point more of a defensive power, at least in Europe, because we respected the Yalta Agreement. We had spheres of influence between the Soviets and the U.S. where we wouldn't violate it. We never, not even Reagan tried to liberate East Germany or intervene in Hungary or Czechoslovakia when they were being invaded by the Red Army. But it was totally provoked. The invasion of Ukraine was totally provoked. So they took back Crimea. It was a bloodless occupation. Crimea it's 75% ethnic Russian, so they all voted 90+% to join Russia. And that's something I strongly supported, even though the Russians occupied it. And then years later, in 2021, so Zelensky was elected president on a campaign of platform of peace with Russia. He sincerely attempted to implement the Minsk II agreement, which would have kept the Donbass, returned the entire Donbass region to Ukrainian control. But there were far right neo-Nazi extremists, militias refused to do it. They threatened his life. They actually threatened his wife's life. And in response to that, he basically made a deal and said, "Okay, if you withdraw your death threats, I'll appoint you to top senior positions in my government, and I'll kind of do what you're bidding from this point on forth." So he decided to do it about face. He said Ukraine would retake the Donbass and Crimea by military force. Russia responded by mobilizing its troops around Ukraine in late March and early April of 2021. Then Biden had a summit with Putin. Putin backed down, withdrew his troops, and then Biden kept escalating. He signed a strategic partnership agreement with Ukraine in November of 2021. That sparked another crisis where Russia massed its troops. Putin on December 7th, 2021, Putin offered to withdraw all Russian troops from Ukraine's borders that had been surged there in exchange for a written guarantee from Biden that that Ukraine would never join NATO. And Biden told him to pound sand. Then a week later, Russia submitted a mutual security agreement, which was a kind of a revamped version of the same agreement that Russia presented to the U.S. back in 2009 and to NATO. And January 25th of 2022, Blinken told Russia we're not going to accept any of your proposed peace agreement. And so essentially Biden chose war. He had every reason to know, and actually he did know because U.S. intelligence knew that if he didn't at least provide a written guarantee to Russia that Ukraine would never join NATO, that Russia was going to invade. And he's very open about that. This invasion was very much provoked. It was certainly in violation of international law. But I wrote an article back in July of 2022 in the National Interest, where I used to be a contributor, and essentially what I said is, we need to put ourselves in Russia's shoes, because if Russia allied with the independent secessionist Texas Republic, and sent a bunch of troops there, 1,000 troops, trained their army, and armed them with missiles which they could use to kill Americans, how would we react to that? And the fact is, we would react by invading, bombing, annexing all of Texas and calling it a defensive war. That's exactly what Russia's done. Except the main difference is they at one point had conquered 30% of Ukrainian territory, and then Putin, beginning the day after Russia invaded, he invited Ukraine to negotiate terms and promised that if the terms were acceptable, all Russian troops would be withdrawn from Ukraine to their pre-war positions. And so Zelensky actually did that. There was the agreement was 90% complete. Ukraine and Russia initialed the neutrality agreement, where Ukraine was going to stay out of NATO, and had all kinds of other provisions that Russia had asked for and Ukraine agreed to accept. And then Putin made the fateful decision to begin withdrawing all Russian troops from northern Ukraine, including 3 Russian oblasts, including Kyiv. So Kyiv had been partially surrounded, the Ukrainian capital, and that pressured Zelensky to make the peace deal. And once he saw the Russian troops withdrawing from Kyiv, he did an about face, and it's like, okay, they're not holding the gun to my head. I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm going to fight them till hell freezes over, because now I have U.S. and British support, and they're telling me they'll arm and fund my government and give me hundreds of billions of dollars to buy mansions and vacation homes and massive amounts of real estate all across the world. So if I ever get ousted, then I can just have my own little real estate empire and travel the world. So that's what he decided to do, and Putin's been he's been trying to end the war ever since. And I predicted in April 2022 that if Ukraine didn't follow through with the peace terms they'd agreed to in March 31st in Istanbul, that Russia would annex 4, actually I said 3, but he actually annexed 4 Ukrainian oblasts. And that would be it. They would never get the territory back. And since September of 2022, I've proposed that a Korean-style armistice to end the war. And that's something that Russia supported. Actually, in between that time, this is maybe interesting to you, in June of 2022, I wrote up a comprehensive 15-point peace plan And in response to that, because it called for a vote, a plebiscite for popular referendum for Ukrainians that live in the Donbass region to vote whether to join to stay part of Ukraine or not. I was put on Ukraine's blacklist along with initially it was 28 other Americans, high-profile Americans, and then became 34 others, including Tucker Carlson, Rand Paul, Tulsi Gabbard, Colonel Douglas McGregor, and later, I've had some Russian media interviews, and they linked my peace plan. Basically, they said that this is something we could live with. So I thought my peace plan was, I viewed it as the minimum acceptable to Russia, the best agreement Ukraine could possibly get. And Russia basically endorsed it, and the Ukrainian government, which is really extreme when it comes to peace and also extremely dictatorial. I'm not saying Putin's not, but the Zelensky regime has been, they've been assassinating opponents, including an American. They assassinated an American um, who had simply had a podcast that broadcasting from Ukraine, basically calling for peace, that Ukraine couldn't win and that the Russians were winning. And, he was, I think, an Argentinian American. And, they imprisoned him a couple times. The second time, he died in prison shortly after they arrested him under suspicious circumstances.
Holy.
So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Okay. Let me ask you this. There's a lot there to unpack, Dave. Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
That stuff, because this isn't the first time I've heard about neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and I'm not sure how much weight to put into it. You mentioned it, and so I want to ask you, is any of that documented? How do we know that went down?
Yes. I read vociferously, so I can't always remember all the sources, but yes, it's absolutely documented. There have been some good interviews of folks with a lot higher profile than myself that have revealed that information, and I can probably get back to you on the sources.
That
But
I would like to throw those sources into the show notes so people
okay,
can themselves. But that is, here's one of the problems I've seen here, right? Is that because I think as people we're naturally wired to look for who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, right? And sometimes there's not a good guy to be found, right? And I look at what's going on.
exactly.
I look at what's going on over there in Ukraine and Russia, and certainly I feel sorry for just the civilians that get caught in the crossfire, right? I mean that sucks. That would stink to be them. But I look at the leadership, and there's no doubt Ukraine was one of the most highly corrupted states, and we seem to just be giving them blank checks everywhere. And I find that very problematic. That's not to say Putin's a good guy. I'm not saying that at all. I think he's a thug too. And so sometimes, and I think this is where Washington's, farewell address comes in, where he says, stay out of foreign entanglements, right? I mean, we think we know what's going on over there, but do we really? Do we have a good understanding of really how the leadership thinks, how they believe? With that, let me ask you this question. How does this end in Russia or Ukraine?
As I said, he's been one thing I do admire about him is he has amazing strategic forbearance, meaning that with all these provocations, U.S. sponsored attacks, U.S. directed attacks on Russian territory, helping Ukraine kill 85,000 Russian troops, you know, 7 Russian generals sinking their flagship, blowing up Nord Stream at the cost of I think 15 to 20 billion to the Russian economy. All those things he's done almost nothing back. I mean, certainly there have been a lot of strange like sabotage and some cyber attacks, which Russia is the main culprit because we're doing it to them. A lot of food plants catching fire and whatnot. I've been amazed. I'm someone who I thought he was like, I never thought he was like Hitler or anything like that, but I did think he had a plan to kind of reassemble a Russian sphere of influence, what I referred to as an Imperial Russian Confederation, in which all the former Soviet republics, with the exception of the Baltics, would become essentially Russian satellites. And I didn't think he intended to enforce that through the use of troops, except in the case of Ukraine. But yeah, he's really surprised me in that he's really stood for peace, and that's so counterintuitive. I mean, to what we hear, like we hear he's a war criminal, totally false. He hasn't ever targeted civilians in Ukraine. In fact, he's taken measures to ensure that Russian forces do not do that. There's only been, I think, 10,700 deaths, Ukraine civilian deaths, that have been logged as of February of this year. So in 2 years, 10 to 11,000 civilian deaths, according to the UN Human Rights Commission. And Israel's killed well more than double that in like 7 months. So Israel's had a I support Israel, by the way, but I'm not going to ignore their war crimes in this instance. But yeah, Putin stood for peace. He's had an olive branch from day one. Biden is in the Biden regime. President Biden threw a temper tantrum. As soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, he basically said, "We're not going to talk to them ever again." I mean, that's like what a little kid does.
Hmm.
We're not going to talk. I mean, Russia is a nuclear superpower, and not only is Biden refusing to negotiate. I mean, he's not even willing to say, "Okay, we're going to meet with you guys, and here are our terms: all Russian troops out of Ukraine." Like, I would be happy if he did that. He won't even meet with Putin. He won't call him on the phone. He won't send him an email. I mean, he's an idiot. I mean, look at JFK. JFK met with Khrushchev. Khrushchev was way more of a thug and a mass murderer than Putin is. I don't even think Putin's a mass murderer. I think he's a dictator, but he's way less bloodthirsty than any other Russian leader we've ever seen, with the exception of Yeltsin. Um, and I mean, that's how you resolve nuclear crises. And instead, Biden is upping the ante. I mean, Blinken came out and said, yeah, we decided to, Zelensky said, hey, we want to hit Russia hard using long-range U.S. missiles and hit their nuclear bombers. And, is that okay? And Blinken's like, yeah, I talked to Biden, and Biden said yes. And we're just going to keep escalating. Whenever Zelensky asks for something, we'll tell him, well, maybe not yet, but really soon. And then pretty soon we'll be in World War III. And Americans will be asking, why did Russia nuke us? Or why did they destroy our country with the cyber or super EMP attack? And maybe not a lot of people will know the answer. You and I will know the answer. But in the end, it's going to be, well, they attacked us because they were fighting essentially a defensive war against U.S. imperialism with regards to NATO, and trying to advance, NATO's imperial borders all the way, across Russia's western frontier. In 1991, I wrote a peace agreement in 1986. I was still in high school, and I wrote a peace agreement that had like 28 points, what the Soviet Union should do, and it was basically like an unconditional surrender. And I think only 5 of those points came to fruition in 1991. I never thought that would actually happen, but it did happen when I was 22. And essentially, the Soviets gave up their empire. And actually, I have an article about why they did that, because it's a question that no one's really ever answered. Like, we have all these, foolish myths that we bankrupted the Soviet Union. Reagan did it. He was really tough. He talked tough to them. They got bankrupted because we never built SDI, but they were afraid that we would. I mean, all these stupid ideas that really make no sense at all. And I have a completely coherent article that I've been working on for like a year. My problem is I only publish about 5 to 10% of what I write. So most people never see a lot of the stuff that I've written. But So the Soviets gave up their entire empire. The U.S. decided to gobble up their Eastern European empire with NATO expansion, and we're quibbling over Ukraine. I mean, if Reagan would roll over in his grave if he knew that we were risking nuclear war, where the chances of nuclear war are higher than they were during the Cuban Missile Crisis, over a country at the farthest eastern fringe of Eastern Europe, in which the U.S. has no discernible national security interests. I didn't say no vital national security interests. I said zero national security interests. Russia could annex all of Ukraine tomorrow, wouldn't pose a threat to the U.S. It wouldn't pose a threat to NATO because Putin has no desire to attack NATO. In the Tucker Carlson interview that he had in February, he made that very clear. He's made that clear since. He said Russia will only attack NATO in response to NATO attacking Russia directly. And now we're talking about combat troops being sent to Ukraine. U.S. military advisors, French military advisors, the British and the French, the Poles have all talked about sending an expeditionary force to fight Russia directly. That would certainly lead to World War III, and um, a very destructive war that could potentially cost 1 billion lives.
Do you think that's where Russia's red line is with the United States, as if we were to attack him directly?
Absolutely. So, for example, if Putin were to escalate with a nuclear demonstration strike anywhere in Ukraine, a lot of crazy retired 4-star generals have talked, 3-star generals have talked about, we should just bomb the crap out of their army in Ukraine or areas of Ukraine they've annexed that have become part of Russia, and then they just back down. I mean, they have 4.5 times more nuclear weapons than we do. They have 35 times more non-strategic nuclear warheads than we do, and they're allied with the nuclear superpower China that it likely has twice as many nukes as we do. So we're completely, back in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had 5 to 9 times more nuclear weapons than the Soviet Union. So there was never really any real risk of nuclear war because the Soviets knew we'd blow them away. We would. There was no question that we would win a nuclear war with the Soviet Union hands down, and we would do so with moderate U.S. casualties. We might lose tens of millions. I mean, they'd lose their whole country basically. Now it's the complete opposite. We would lose hands down, and we would lose the first half an hour of any major war where they escalated to the cyber super EMP or nuclear level. And so, essentially the U.S. has 4 guns to its head, maybe 10. If we make a wrong move, any one of those guns can fire, maybe all of them. Maybe they'll fire all at the same time, like the end of if you've seen the movie Civil War, where they assassinated a Trump-like president at the end of the movie. He begs for mercy, and they multiple former U.S. troops execute him at the same time. So that's kind of the situation we're facing right now, and very few national security experts are willing to admit it. I've written a comprehensive strategy on how to disrupt and divide and neutralize the Sino-Russian military alliance, and very few military strategists, with the exception of Dr. John Mearsheimer, have come up with another similar idea. He's the only one that I know of that's well known that has come up with that same idea. And my plan's a lot more detailed. But he's the foremost realist scholar. He recommends my Substack, by the way, and I think he's pretty amazing. If only we had him as a national security advisor, our country would be a lot better off right now.
So that would be the red line for Putin, to use something, like, I shouldn't say physical, but more direct methods. What would be his red line for, like, that catastrophic cyber attack you talk about? Is that a different line, or do you think that's it? It's one line period?
I think it's one line period. Yeah. So what I've been saying is Russia or China, if we get into a direct war with either of them, on day one of major combat operations, they will hit us. He'll hit us with everything they have, with cyber and counter space attacks. So take it all over satellites. Cyber attack will take out all of our communications, internet, finance, banking system, food distribution system, critical infrastructure, power. A lot of, there's some neoconservatives that talk about, oh, World War III is already underway and we just need to fight and win it. And I'm like, no, World War, you don't even know what a World War is. I mean, World War is when you're fighting an enemy on the battlefield on multiple fronts across the world, or at least, Atlantic and Pacific, right? Asia
Right.
and Europe, or the Americas. And, essentially, we will know that when World War III starts, when the power goes off and it never comes back on again.
Okay.
I mean, there's a slight chance that they could let up on their cyber attacks if we were to surrender, and say, we'll have a conditional surrender. This is what we'll do to meet your requirements, and we'll disarm or whatnot. We'll take our nuclear forces off alert, and then I think there's a good chance they would agree to that, lift their cyber attack, and we could have power restored. But the chance of that, I think, are very low. I think if they hit us hard with cyber, maybe super EMP, then that's it. We're not gonna surrender, and we might not even have anyone that can surrender because our communications will be down,
Yeah.
and maybe our leadership will be dead.
Gotcha. Whew. All right, let's talk about China for a minute, because this is the other vector, if you will, of instability that we're facing right now. What's China's motive behind wanting Taiwan?
So China has been wanting Taiwan for 75 years. The Chinese Civil War obviously started in the 1920s, went through the or Second Sino-Japanese War that lasted essentially from 1937 to 1945. And then when Japan was defeated, 1946, Truman withdrew all U.S. military aid and logistics supplies to, food and fuel, whatnot, to the nationalist freedom fighters led by Chiang Kai-shek. And invariably, the Red Chinese won. And so Chiang fled with the remains of his National Revolutionary Army to Taiwan, and was able to keep Taiwan independent for 75 years with initially with the U.S. security guarantee that lasted until Jimmy Carter decided to embrace a one China policy and essentially give up our defense of Taiwan. So we withdrew all 25,000 troops that we had during the Vietnam War that were based in Taiwan. We pulled out our nuclear weapons. And today we have 300 troops, special forces that are training Taiwanese in counterinsurgency tactics. But essentially, the answer is the Chinese view Taiwan as unfinished business. Essentially, Taiwan has the only government which has a legitimate claim to the leadership of mainland China. And so they've been planning on, they've been working assiduously for the past, 3 decades in particular, building up the Chinese military to ensure that they would be guaranteed to win any war with the U.S. over Taiwan. And so they reached that point, in my assessment, about 2020, and they've just been waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger. I think they'll likely do a blockade, but with the election of President Biden, who was essentially a Manchurian president, as Trump has alleged, I think they view this as a window of opportunity they can't afford to pass up. I mean, Biden's gone all out to weaken the U.S., both at home and abroad. He's trying to imprison his only real presidential challenger in Riker Island State Prison that is known for people getting stabbed and killed. And he's essentially importing communist Chinese methods to the U.S. and being an authoritarian president, dictatorial president, trying to establish a one-party Marxist police state. And at the same time, he's using kind of woke Marxism to indoctrinate our military and weaken it that way, demoralize it, make it so no one wants to join. Focusing on climate change. There was a member of AUSA. I'm a former state chapter vice president, and a recent cover of Army magazine showed, basically said that the greatest enemy that the U.S. Army was facing was the weather. It wasn't China. It wasn't Russia. It wasn't North Korea or Iran. It was the weather. So the U.S. Army is devising a new strategy to fight climate change, which is, we all know, is anyone with half a brain knows that man-made climate change is non-existent. It impacts 2% of the weather temperature changes that are cyclical. So that's where he's spending most of our effort trying to make the Army go green. Not the traditional Army green, where I wore
Right,
green
right,
uniforms,
yeah,
but rather green, green environmental extremism, type stuff.
right.
So, yeah, I think Xi Jinping, he's 70 years old. I've I've assessed that he will likely make his move after the 75th anniversary celebration of the founding of the People's Republic of China. They always do a big military parade in early October. It's October 1st. So I would assess that second week of October. By that point, there would be a full Chinese military blockade, be an air and naval blockade of Taiwan, and then I think that President Xi Jinping will say, "This is your last chance. We want peaceful reunification. If U.S., if you're willing to help us out with that, then we can avoid a world war. And if you're not, you're not. U.S. isn't going to exist anymore." As the Russian government stated, with regards to Biden's decision to allow Ukraine to use U.S. missiles deep into Russia, it may be a fatal mistake, and it will be a fatal mistake. I'm predicting. So, I think the answer is we have to end our policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan. We simply say Biden just needs to say the same thing about Taiwan that he said about Ukraine. We've right before Russia invaded Ukraine, he said the U.S. under no circumstances will the U.S. defend or Ukraine militarily, because that would be World War III in his words. And if he just were to say publicly that the U.S. would not defend Taiwan militarily, then China will not destroy us, won't cyber attack us, it won't super EMP us, it won't nuke us, and we can establish a red line that kind of an invisible nuclear red line that surrounds all of our treaty allies, Japan, Philippines, Australia, and South Korea, and say, we're going to defend these four countries, and we're willing to negotiate on other stuff, other island claims, um, shoals and rocks and reefs where no one lives, such as those are kind of the other focus of China and the South China Sea. We can negotiate those issues, but you can have peaceful reunification with Taiwan. We'll negotiate like an EU style reunification agreement, confederation that I proposed. I think it was last October. And we can peacefully coexist, and we can still pursue a competition, and we'll have trade wars with you, but no military wars, and then I think the U.S. can live happily ever after. But otherwise, I think the risks to the U.S. Our very existence are very extreme and very perilous.
Okay, so let me ask a couple questions here in regards to China's timing on this. Would it not have made more sense to do a military blockade of Taiwan in like year two of the Biden presidency? I mean, look, we don't know what Trump's going to do. I'm a guy who says he's not the savior of the republic, right? I'm not saying that. Um, he's been just as bad as everybody else. I don't know how else to put it in some ways, right? He did do some things that I was surprised with, but by and large, he neither shocked me with how bad he was or impressed me with how good he was. Having said that, he is a guy that is a bit of a wild card, right? And so if you're China, you have to take that into account, I would think. So wouldn't have like year two been more ideal if China was going to send a blockade to Taiwan, where you know that you have 2 years of Joe Biden, and you made the statement, and I want to go back to that here in a second, that he's kind of a Manchurian candidate. But Wouldn't that have been the time to do it rather than right before a United States election where there's a possibility of getting the wild card back in the office?
Want more from the Mormon Renegade podcast? Head over to the Mormon Renegade Rumble page to see all the videos from the podcast and the fundamental news program for free. Still not enough? Then join the Mormon Renegade Locals page by clicking the red join button, and for $5 a month, you can have access to podcast transcripts, Renegade exclusives, as well as weekly live stream show with the host Dave Sanders. Click the link in this episode's show notes today.
Wouldn't that have been the time to do it rather than right before a United States election where there's a possibility of getting the wild card back in the office?
It's interesting. I actually think it's the opposite. I think that Biden's the wild card, and Trump is the safe bet. I think that Trump actually in John Bolton's book, he told John Bolton and other of his top national security advisors that because China is 100 miles from Taiwan and we're 8,000 miles from Taiwan, he was probably referring to the center of the U.S. That there's nothing we could do. That China would be guaranteed to be able to overrun Taiwan, and then we would be faced with the decision as to whether to stage a D-Day style invasion from a distance of 6,900 miles from the U.S. Pacific coast, and that would be one that would be guaranteed to fail for a lot of reasons. China's got tremendous firepower. They have feeder nuclear supremacy. We have no nuclear weapons stationed in the Far East or Western Pacific, outside of some theater nuclear weapons that are deployed on our nuclear missile submarines, of which we have two on station in the Pacific at any time and two traveling back to home port, or to and from station. So, and they have the largest nuclear ballistic missile force in the world, that has, I think it's 7 to 11 times as many missiles as we do. They've doubled the size of the missile force in just the last 3 years. So there's just no chance. And I think Trump knows that. Trump is, he's so much more pro peace. Like, he's so focused on avoiding World War III. Like, as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, he's like, this could lead to a nuclear war. And he's like, in September of 2022, he said, I want to lead a U.S. delegation to end this war in 24 hours. And he was passionate about that. That's what I love about Trump. So yes, he had some deep state officials that he made mistakes in promoting to senior level positions in his first term. He didn't do as much good as he hoped to. He wanted to make a comprehensive peace with Russia. He wanted to divide the Sino-Russian alliance. Ukraine never would have been invaded if he had been president in 2022. But I actually think there's more risk to China to invade while Biden is president than Trump being president. So if I were an advisor to Xi Jinping and I know what I know about Trump, I'd be saying, let's wait it out. I mean, maybe I wouldn't go that far, because I think that China knows that they can win either way. Even if Biden puts up a fight, they can take us out. But the safer bet would definitely be to wait till Trump was president. But I don't think they believe that. I think they agree with the consensus view that Trump's more of a wild card, and that they're not sure what he would do. Maybe he would defend Taiwan, maybe he wouldn't. So I do think that the fact that the next election is happening in November, and that it could go, they could maybe rigging the vote's not good enough. I mean, I'm sure it is, but maybe it's not in their view. And then Biden loses, Trump wins, and then Trump he's inaugurated to a second term in January, and then their window is over. So that's why I think that Taiwan would likely surrender within 3 weeks of a blockade beginning, if the U.S. didn't take decisive action to stop, to fight China. Taiwan would know that there's no point to delaying their surrender. But the better choice is to avoid war altogether and try to have a compromise agreement, as I proposed, which keeps Taiwan in control of their military, allows them self-rule, doesn't allow any permanent, Chinese troop stationing on their main island, actually none at all. I think China would agree to that. I don't think they'd honor it certainly wouldn't honor it for, 20 years, but at least it could provide for a more gradual transition that doesn't get hundreds of thousands, if not hundreds of millions of innocent people killed.
I know one of the big concerns about Taiwan is it supplies like 90 some percent of the world's chips, right? Microchips, processing chips, those sorts of things. What happens if China does take over? What happens to our ability to get those chips that, let's face it, that run the world now, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's the thing. China could take over all of East Asia, including Taiwan, Japan, and they would still trade with us. You know, the problem is the U.S. can't allow that. We should militarily defend Japan. Um, and when it comes to Taiwan, my recommendation, if I was National Security Advisor to President Trump, I would say we need to stay out of the fight militarily, but we need to go full economic war on China. And the estimate is if we get cut off from those advanced computer chips that are made in Taiwan, we probably lose about 8, maybe even 9% of our GDP. During the Great Depression, we lost 8%. So people think times are tough now. They don't have a clue. I mean, that would be another Great Depression, potentially worse than the first. I would think not worse than the first, because for a number of reasons. But I would think it would be almost as bad. But the option is, there's two options. One is we don't sanction China. If we have minor sanctions on China from the invasion, they'll keep trading with us. They'll keep selling us the chips. The economy will remain half decent. The other option is we go to war full on with them and they destroy 100% of our economy because after a massive cyber attack or a super EMP attack, the U.S. wouldn't really have an economy. It'd have a barter economy. The U.S. dollar would become worthless. Obviously, goes without saying the banks, ATMs wouldn't work. Whatever money we had invested would be gone. Stock market would be gone. So it's a trade-off. And Taiwan, unlike the Ukraine, we actually do have a strategic interest in Taiwan's independence. And so that's why I've come up with a plan that could, maintain their self-rule short of war and essentially achieve more gradual transition. Now, essentially, best case, it would end up being like Hong Kong. Hong Kong was, was supposed to be 20 plus years. I think it was about 20 years that China respected the agreement to keep Hong Kong, with self-rule. And that's definitely best case for a Taiwan scenario. But even if it was 10, even if it was 5, I mean, there's nothing we can do to deter a Chinese blockade or invasion of Taiwan. It's going to happen this year or next year, I guarantee it. And we could double the number of our nuclear submarines. We could move all of our nukes, what few we have left in Europe, and we can move them to East Asia or on U.S. Pacific fleet carriers, as I proposed. And they'd do it anyway because it's their number one goal. It's kind of their nuclear red line. It's, just as if it's very similar to the case where, the U.S. expanded its empire into Ukraine, made it another protectorate or imperial dependency, and kept moving troops and bases and missiles into Ukraine within a 300-mile range of Moscow. So Taiwan's different because Taiwan doesn't pose a threat to China. We don't have troops. We have 300 troops, but they're lightly armed. But they waited 75 years. I mean, 75 years of failed diplomacy. Putin had 15 years of failed diplomacy. So neither Russia or China want war with the U.S. They've done a lot to avoid it, but they're both willing to fight us if we attack them first. So, if we defend Taiwan militarily, if we take active measures to break the blockade by shooting down Chinese planes and sinking their warships, it's no holds barred, And same thing with Russia. If we send tens of thousands of troops, start having massive missile strikes on Russian troops, he'll just, he'll take us out with power, and that's the end of the U.S. as a country, not just as a superpower, probably as a country as well. So, we had a lot of gains in the Cold War. We expanded NATO to Eastern Europe. The entire Warsaw Pact is now part of NATO. We can keep all those gains. My message is we can, all those countries can remain part of the U.S. sphere of influence, or at least kind of pro-Western, maybe not protectorates. Like, I don't think Eastern Europe should have any U.S. military guarantees. But we could, NATO can continue to exist along its current borders. And all we have to do is compromise on Taiwan and Ukraine, and then threats essentially over. We fight them on trade, on the economy. Obviously, we have to maintain strengthen our military, strengthen our missile defenses, build, double the size of our nuclear arsenal. But we can survive as a country. And so what I've been doing is I've been championing what I call a national security strategy of assured national survival that accomplishes that. But we just don't have the leaders that we need to have that are realists. Realists of the Cold War style realists that understand the limits of U.S. power and what we need to do to ensure our national existence and prevent nuclear war.
Okay. So I got just a couple more questions here, because I know you're kind of up against some time here. But we talked about what it would look like for China to take out 9 to 10% of our GDP if they stopped trading with us. It's catastrophic, right? It's hard to fight a war if you're hungry. I mean, that's just all there is to it. Armies got to eat. You got to be able to fund those. What does it look like if we get hit by that massive cyber attack or that super EMP that you talked about? What's the conditions on the ground for the average family?
I mean, our critical infrastructure is what sustains life. Essentially, it's 20th century electric power technology, industrial technology that is what has enabled the U.S. population to grow from 38 million in the late 1880s to 285 million American citizens today. So we have 51.6 million non-citizens, illegals and legal immigrants in our country. So that's a combined population of 336 million. So without that, people will begin to run out of food. There won't be any food in the food in the grocery stores will be gone in 3 to 7 days. The storage centers might last a couple of weeks if we can have access to it. Walmart and Costco type storage centers. And the water will not stop flowing. So people that don't have water sources will begin to die. People starve to death. Roving mobs will, kind of gangs will attack people just for their food and other stuff, take over their houses and whatnot. Law enforcement will break down. Emergency services will be gone. Hospitals won't be able to function. Cars won't work. Now, of course, if it's a cyber attack, all of that can be temporary, as I said, because a cyber attack can be turned on and off by our enemies. It's possible we could have some kind of mitigation that makes it so, power in some areas can be restored along with gas supplies. But I think chances are pretty high that that would not happen unless we had a negotiated peace where that's, they agreed to do that. So it'd be the U.S. wouldn't be able to function. The U.S. government would not be able to function. Sure, a lot of our top elite leaders would have their bunkers. A lot of billionaires and people that are worth 100 million plus will have safe areas where have their own private militias, and deep underground they can ride out a nuclear war, whatever the case might be. But for the average American that doesn't own a farm, or lives in an urban area, it's going to be a lot of mayhem and scenes we haven't seen since Book of Mormon days.
True. How much cooperation is happening between Russia and China right now? Is any of this coordinated? Are they like, hey, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of a thing? Or are they just pursuing separate interests, and those separate interests just happen to cross American lines, so to speak?
So I wrote a never published book about the Sino-Russian alliance. I started writing it in 95. I mostly finished in 97. I just never got it published. But essentially, the focus of the book was the threat from the Sino-Russian alliance. So the Sino-Russian alliance didn't actually become formalized until July 2001. I was warning about it way earlier in the 90s. And then when I was getting my second graduate degree at Georgetown University from their School of Foreign Service, I had an oral thesis that I had to defend, and my thesis was the Sino-Russian alliance, military alliance, will be the greatest existential threat the U.S. will face in the 21st century. And the entire focus of our national security strategy should be figuring out how to divide, disrupt, and break it up. And no one really, I mean, almost no one. Like if I would do searches, all through like 2020, even to some extent in 2021, to see if anyone else believed the same way as I did, and almost no one did. Like the national security experts, no one really admitted, with a few exceptions, that Russia and China were military allies until 2022, when on February 4th at the Beijing Olympics, Xi and Putin announced their no limits partnership, which they said was greater than alliance. Like we're not just allies, there's no limits to how far we'll go for each other. So China, of course, has provide massive aid to Russia throughout the war in Ukraine, mostly in the area of military strategic resources, so strategic minerals and industrial resources to maximize Russia's military production of tanks, aircraft, missiles, drones, etc. And that's really the best thing that Russia needed, most important thing that will help them defeat Ukraine. But also they provided combat drones almost from the beginning, and other weapons that most people don't know about, that they've been helping out with. But essentially, what the Sino-Russian alliance is, and I discussed this at length with Vivek Ramaswamy, who I worked for when he ran for president as his defense and foreign policy advisor, and he flew me up to his headquarters in Ohio, and I briefed him back in May and subsequently. But the Sino-Russian alliance, it's a real alliance, but it's a defensive alliance. So when I say defensive, essentially what the terms are is, if the U.S. attacks Russia directly, China will come to Russia's aid militarily. They'll enter the war, whether that's establishing invading Taiwan, attacking Japan, attacking U.S. military bases. They'll essentially open a new front. And essentially, it's the same thing for Russia. If China is attacked by the U.S. Over a war in Taiwan, then Russia's job is to establish a second front to draw off U.S. forces as well, attack U.S. NATO bases, whatever the case might be. So the thing about treaties is you never know for sure if an ally is actually going to go to war. For example, with regards to NATO, we have Article 5 of the Atlantic Charter. It doesn't actually commit the U.S. to go to war. A lot of people say it's an ironclad commitment. We'd have to go to war. It'd be World War III if Lithuania got invaded, or Estonia. That's not true. We could send a strongly worded letter to Russia protesting the invasion, and then send them some small arms, and we would be fulfilling our obligations under Article 5. So it's a very weak alliance. So what I'm trying to say is You never know if an ally will go to war until it actually happens. So I can't guarantee. I think that if Russia got attacked, I do think China would attack Taiwan, but mainly just because that's what they're planning to do it imminently. Um, but if I can't guarantee that if the U.S. were to attack China, I don't know if Russia would attack us directly back.
Okay.
But I think they'd probably take over all of Ukraine. They probably just ramp up and do it that way. And that if the U.S. intervened, then they would strike us and destroy us directly, is what I would anticipate.
Holy cow. Okay. And then let me ask you this. This is something I've often wondered. I'm a land surveyor by profession, and there was a time I went down with a pretty significant knee injury. So I actually just did a ton of reading. And Russia has always kind of fascinated me, right? I remember being a very young kid, right? I remember when the Berlin Wall came down. I remember, you know, I remember the thing, if I'm not mistaken, is either when Russia fell officially or the wall came down. It was Saturday morning, and I was really irritated because I was trying to watch cartoons, and Dan Rather pops up and like, "Hey, you want to wake up your parents, kids," sort of a thing. But since that time, I've always kind of been fascinated with what happened there, and then also where that leaves Russia now, because it's always felt like they were a bit of an enigma, a little bit. And I happened to stumble across Fourth Political Theory, something written by a guy named Dugin, Alexander Dugin, if I'm not mistaken. How much, and I understand that he's got a little bit of clout over there. Do you know much about him? Do you know any particulars there?
Yeah, I think Dugin's talked about, how Putin should act to reestablish some kind of Russian empire along their 1800 borders, which actually leaves a number of former Soviet republics out. Um, I don't think they would include the Caucasus republics, for example. Moldova wasn't part of the Russian Empire at that point. I think there were areas of Ukraine that weren't part of Russia. Um, I think Poland, yeah, Poland was partially part of Russia, just like kind of an eastern part, maybe the area like Belarus, essentially, and maybe Western Ukraine. So, I used to think that maybe that was Putin's final plan. But once Putin withdrew all Russian troops out of northern Ukraine, I realized that he's not an imperialist. He's just not. I mean, that's not what he's about. He doesn't want to take over regions. The war in Ukraine had nothing to do with territory whatsoever. He was willing to withdraw Russian troops out of Ukraine from the beginning of the war until September of 2022, when he's like, fine, you guys aren't going to make peace with me. I guess I'll have to annex some territory, get your attention. So that's kind of what he did. It was his plan B. It wasn't his main priority. The U.S., of course, we have an empire. It's not like a tyrannical empire like
Sure.
the Soviets had or the Nazis had or anything like that, or the British even had. It's more, it's a benevolent empire, but it's an empire nevertheless. We're a republic and an empire, and essentially we have all these protectorates, and all these countries depend on us for their defense. In return, they allow us to control their defense policy. They're kind of almost vassal states in some instances. Even Germany, to some extent, I mean, we bombed the crap out of their infrastructure. Nord Stream was half German owned. Was an unprovoked attack on a NATO ally by the U.S. and the U.S. And Germany didn't say a peep. They just took it. Of course, there's reasons for that. We re-educated that. Eisenhower rejected them to become self-loathing pacifists, and then we get mad at them. We destroy their country and took a third of their land away, and now we get mad at them because they don't spend 2% on defense. It's pretty hypocritical. But that's a whole different story. But yeah, it's I don't give Dugin any weight. I don't think I think Putin likes him because he's a nationalist like Putin, but I don't think Putin really gives weight to his theories in terms of retaking territory.
So he's not that influential in your estimation.
I think Russia likes him. I mean, Putin likes him. I think he's he's a friend, but I don't think he sets policy at all. That's what I'm trying to say.
Perfect. Nope. Perfect. In your estimation, do you think we can still avoid a hot war with Russia and China, or do you think we've gone too far?
I think it'd be very simple, extremely simple to avoid a war with Russia and China. It couldn't be any more simple, in theory. And all we need is a president of the United States like Trump, who's willing to do the right thing for America and avert World War III. The problem is, I don't think Trump's going to win. Trump's leading Biden by 5 points, and the poll that I consider the most reliable right now, even after his conviction, he lost 7 points from that. Used to lead him by 12 points. But I think Biden's going to steal the election. I think we're led by Gadiant and robbers right now. Essentially, it's a mafia cartel of Marxists that is what the Democrat Party has become. They've weaponized, federal law enforcement agencies against their opponents. Not just Trump, but the J6ers and you and me. Um, and we don't live in a free republic anymore. It's sad for me to say because I was willing to put my life on. I never served in combat, but I was a combat arms officer, armor officer in the Army during the 1990s. Yeah, I mean we've let it slip away, and when you're in a kind of a dictatorship type country, as we are under Biden, and that can change if Trump wins, we can be free again. But you there's the chances of liberating yourself are very, very low. A lot of people say like, oh, we want the people to rise up against Putin and liberate Russia. I don't think Russia needs to be liberated. I don't think, Putin's, he's a bad guy, but he's not that bad. He's certainly someone we can work with. He's not a mass murderer like Xi Jinping. But there's really, I had this discussion earlier this week on a different podcast, and we were talking about, what could we do? And my answer was, we should never, ever commit any acts of violence against the U.S. government or anyone else for that matter, but except foreign invaders. For the only reason, I'm not a pacifist, but I'm a Latter-day Saint, so I just don't support that. But if for the only reason that they have F-16s, they have nukes, they have they have the army and the military, and they would we'd be crushed. I mean, Tiananmen Square, the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, which is 2 days ago,
Mm-hmm.
and it's said that China massacred 10,000. It was likely closer to 100,000. It was like maybe 50 to 100,000, probably 80,000. And they just ran over them with tanks. I mean, just stuff like that. Just machine gunned them. A lot of patriots and freedom fighters, and as a result, there's no freedom fighters really left in China. There's no forces. There's no possibility, even remote possibility, of China ever being liberated, short of nuclear war and state collapse. So that's what happens, in dictatorial authoritarian states is, people try to change, it's not like during the Revolutionary War where, it was all kind of, muskets and smoothbore rifles, where, you could actually challenge the government militarily and actually, have a fairly level playing field. So, yeah, we're in a terrible situation. I think Ether 8 applies in the Book of Mormon. Wake to your awful situation, and we need to turn back to God and be as faithful as we possibly can. And I think the Lord will bless us if we do so.
Just two more questions, and I'm going to let you go. I apologize. I'm holding you over just a little bit here, but I find this stuff so fascinating. There's no doubt if we were to do what you are saying, right, which I don't necessarily think can be discounted and certainly isn't a bad idea, but there is a sense of retreat a little bit in this, right? And again, that is probably the prudent course at this point because we are in no condition to fight a war. We're just not. I mean, quite frankly, I'm not sure we have the stomach for it yet, and we certainly don't have the infrastructure for it. the thought of just taking that loss and retreating from the world stage a little bit there, is there something that we can do to come back after that? Do we rally things at home? Do we start producing more stuff at home? I mean, when I look and see that 90% of the world's chips are made in Taiwan, um, uh, an exorbitant amount of our pharmaceuticals come from China. Not much, not to say anything, about the cheap crap that we buy from Walmart, that we buy even more during hard economic times, right? What do we do in the aftermath of that?
Well, I almost have to laugh. I mean, not what you're saying, because I think what you're saying is so representative of what Americans feel, like what they've been indoctrinated to believe. It wouldn't be a retreat. I mean, first of all, Ukraine. I mean, yeah, I guess you could say it'd be humiliating, whatnot, because we've invested so much in it. Taiwan. I mean, we have 300 troops there. We don't have a single. We have three tiny military bases in Taiwan. I just don't see it as a retreat. We don't
Okay.
have any helicopters. We don't have. I mean, maybe we have a couple. We don't have any airplanes. We don't have any ports, naval bases. We don't have any missiles. So I just don't see. Yeah, I don't see that as a retreat. Ukraine, have so much invested that I think that would be viewed as more of a retreat. Um, but I'm one who, and maybe I'm part of an almost extinct species. The so-called isolationists. We never had isolationists. There was never any isolationists in America. We had a debate between what I call the hemispheric hegemonists and the global hegemonists. And the global hegemonists won, and the hemispheric hegemonists lost out. And those were the America First folks. So thanks to Donald Trump, we've resurrected, the America First movement. But it's not quite the hemispheric superpower crowd that, kind of focus that I think we should have. Because if, the bottom line is, and what I've been saying for almost 20 years now, is if we were to pull out all our military bases from Europe and Asia, Russia and China would leave us alone. North Korea would leave us alone. Iran would leave us alone. They only want to attack and destroy us because uh, we're provoking them. We're trying to expand our sphere of influence and our empire right up their borders. Not in the case of Israel, or Iran rather. Obviously, North Korea. We've been in South Korea since the end of World War II, and Korean War, of course, never really ended. We're still technically at war with China
Mhm.
and North Korea. But I mean, that's really the issue. The issue is, we're in their faces, we're in their backyard, we're poking them in the eye, and all we need to do is have like a buffer zone. Russia talks about the need for a buffer zone where, and that's really what Putin really wanted. In his security agreement that he asked for, it was all about. He didn't say Russia or NATO needs to recede by 1 square inch. He just said, Western troops need to withdraw from Eastern Europe. And so they would, under my national security strategy, we would return to that, which is, it's not pre 1999 or 1997 that he's asking for, or that I think we should do. It would be pre July 2016, because we didn't have any troops in Eastern Europe until July 2016 under Obama in his last year. So yeah, I don't view it as a retreat. Certainly, it would be retrenchment. Retrenchment is a national security strategy where you do kind of pull back your sphere of influence at the fringes. But a retreat to me would be like point out of NATO. And
Okay.
again, I don't view that as negative. I think that
Sure.
would make the U.S. so much safer and more secure. Um, I don't support pulling out of, Japan, obviously, or South Korea. Um, But I think those are two countries that are we can defend long term. And North Korea is on a short leash. If we attack China, North Korea will be unleashed, and they'll invade South Korea, and we'll be in a war on 3 to 4 fronts against 3 to 4 nuclear superpowers or nuclear powers. So as you said, it's just unwinnable. It's not that we're not in a condition to fight 3 to 4 nuclear powers at the same time. It's that we're unable to fight and win a war against even one nuclear superpower at one time. So, when you're strong, you get to be the biggest boy in the block, as General Powell famously stated during the Iraq War hearings, and you can invade whatever country you want unprovoked and get away with it. And that's the way the U.S. acted in Iraq. But when you're weak, you have to make hard choices. It's kind of like having a lot of money or having you can be a billionaire. You can do whatever you want essentially on the world stage. But you're living paycheck to paycheck, your choices are very limited, and that's kind of we're not quite to that point. That was kind of an extreme example, but it kind of gives you an idea of when you have less military forces, when the enemy has 6 times more nuclear weapons than you do, when their industrial power is China alone can make weapons 5 to 6 times faster than we can in terms of advanced weapons. They can build ships and warships 32 times faster. So even if it was just a purely conventional war, no cyber, no super EMP, no counter space, they would still beat us, sweep across the Pacific, and then decide whether to invade the U.S. West Coast or blow us away, Hiroshima style, at the end of the war.
Ooh, man. So let me ask you this: with all this that you just laid out, if you were a betting man, now I know you're not. You're an LDS. You're a good LDS guy. I know you're not a betting man. But if you had to wager, what do you think the chances are that this ends up in a hot war with Russia and China at this point?
I think it's 50%. We have a 50% chance of being in a world war by the end of the year.
Okay.
And it just rests with Biden. It's not, like I said, China and Russia don't want a direct war with the U.S. But if only we had a decent president, we could trust, instead of a doddering old fool that probably wears Depends. First president in U.S. history that wears an adult diaper. As it appears that he had to change his diaper in a limousine just earlier today or yesterday at the D-Day celebration, the 75th anniversary or 80th anniversary, I guess. But he just, if he would just, I joke about this. It's funny, but it's also crazy at the same time. If he would just remember that he's a Chinese controlled agent and that he's not supposed to go to war against China, then the U.S. is going to be all right. I mean, I think there would be, there would likely be a very deep recession or depression, whether we go to war against them directly or not, because I think that there will be, he'll feel pressure to do massive sanctions on China, maybe not massive, but pretty severe, like stuff we haven't done since since Nixon, in terms of trade being reduced.
Right.
Then yeah, we go through a depression. It's not as bad as the Great Depression. And then we recover, we bounce back. So yeah, it just really depends on whether he remembers that he's a Chinese agent or not. If he forgets and he says the same crap that he said 4 times in a row before the last time, that the U.S. is obligated by treaty to defend Taiwan, which we haven't been since 78 or 79 when he was in his 30s in the Senate during the Carter years, then I think we have a very good chance of avoiding war with China. The problem is, as I said, I fear an accidental conflict, clash, like if he keeps talking tough and he sends naval forces all the way up to the line, which he kind of does in Russia, where he goes all the way up the nuclear red line, and then he says, okay, I won't cross the nuclear red line, but then he keeps trying to push the nuclear red line farther, just to see how far he can go. And then at some point, China and Russia are going to go, okay, you kept crossing it, and we're just going to wipe you out, and we won't have to worry about you anymore. And of course, they don't want to do that for the trade reasons. They'll have an economic downturn, but they're willing to do it. And I think we're foolish. I think U.S. leaders. I watch Fox News and I hear all these U.S. leaders talking about, like Speaker Johnson. They're completely out of lunch. He's talking about how the U.S. is, we're still the greatest military superpower. I mean, that hasn't been the case since at least the 90s, maybe never. I mean, certainly we were at the end of World War II, and we were actually in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and early 70s. We were the strongest military superpower on the planet. I don't think we necessarily have been since. And we had this illusion that, just because Russia didn't oppose NATO expansion militarily, it's because they were too weak. That's not true. They could have done to Poland in 1999 what they're doing to Ukraine right now before Poland joined NATO, and we wouldn't have fought them. I have another article I'm working on that, but I'm really big into alternate history. But it's all about, they've been led by leaders who are pro-peace, who are not imperialists. Enemy threat adversarial threat is determined by intentions and capabilities. Russia's had the capability to destroy us since at least the early 60s. The ability to nuke us since 1951 to some extent, but they haven't had the intention. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, they haven't had the intention to destroy the U.S. It's something that they'd be reluctant to do, but they would do if we went to war against them directly. So I'm hoping and praying that that Biden doesn't listen to his advisors when China blockades Taiwan, doesn't listen to idiots like Speaker Johnson, Mitch McConnell, and Lindsey Graham, and he listens to saner folks urging him to pursue a cautious response and de-escalate. And if he de-escalates, both with regards to Ukraine, there have been some rumors that he's planning on making peace with Putin over Ukraine after the election, but he's afraid to do it before because he thinks it might make him look weak. So I was subscribing to that until recently. I think he's probably more likely to escalate at this point because he's just such a fool and idiot, and he's got horrible advisors that are urging him on, egging him on to pursue this policy of national suicide. So, yeah, I mean, we can't have a lot of confidence in Biden, but absolutely, there's a 50% chance that we survive the year.
What should the average Mormon family do to prepare for the worst, right? I'm a big believer in you plan for the worst and then you kind of hope for the best.
Well, the number one thing to do is to turn back to the Lord, become as close to God as possible, repent of our sins. I mean, I have a lot to repent of myself. I make mistakes every day. You want to have a bug out plan. You want to store as much food and water as possible, medicine, different supplies like that, life-saving pharmaceuticals. If possible, you want to relocate to a rural area. If you have any possibility to have your own food production, do that. I've always said if I was a rich man, if I was a millionaire, I'd buy myself a small farm. They'll be the best off. The new currency will be food. So if you have massive food storage, if you have a farm, you'll be upper class. People will come to you and you can barter whatever you need. And, people will be dependent on you for supplies and whatnot. If you're unable to relocate to a rural area, then you want to be able to have a bug out plan. So think of friends or family that live well outside populated areas. The more rural, the better, the safer. And I happen to live in an area that has more cattle and livestock than people. So I recently made that move a few years ago. So I feel a lot safer now. I was previously in the kind of the Salt Lake suburban area. So yeah, those are my recommendations. Solar power, I think solar power generators are the way to go in terms of power needs.
Well, David, that was good stuff, man. Look, I always say this, you've been on here once, you got a standing invitation to come back on. As things get further along here, would you mind coming back on and just updating every so often?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So I really enjoyed this. I appreciate your time. Let's talk about your Substack real quick. Where can people find you out there on Substack?
Yeah, so it's the Real War newsletter. It's at dpyne.substack.com. Once again, dpyne.substack.com. So I published, I don't know, 150 articles over the past couple of years. I some of my articles are lengthy because I deliberately choose not to publish like short 700 to 1,000 word pieces because I just don't feel you can really write anything of substance. Like with where 1,000 I think is probably the minimum where you can write an article that actually has meaning. And I'll find all these articles that online that the titles sound great. It sounds like something that would really make a difference and make people think. And then you read it and it's like 700 words and it doesn't say anything.
Right.
So yeah, some of my articles are pretty long, and that's why I don't publish as often. I'd rather publish like 4 articles a month that are substantive than one every day, because I could write like 4 times a week. But yeah, go to you can sign up as viewers can sign up either as a free subscriber. Almost all my articles are free at this point. There are certain things that are for paid premium or paid subscribers only. But I think that my archive gets cut off after three weeks. So my best articles are ones that I published more than 3 weeks ago, of course. Grand strategy, all kinds of different stuff. So I had to try to subscribe under a different and log in under a different email address to see if I can access them. But yeah, it's just $5.99 a month if you want to be a paid subscriber, $59 a year. So not too bad.
Perfect. Anywhere else they can find your work? You publish anywhere else?
Yeah. So the national interest, if you look up, just do a search, David Pyne, national interest, you can find my article archive from there. Stretches back to, I think, 2018. I've also done some like alternate World War I and II history. And then, of course, if you type my name in Amazon, you'll find the book I co-authored. It was actually written under the name of Peter Pry, who's our late executive director. And I was the second. So there's multiple authors, multiple contributors rather, but I was one of only three co-authors, and I wrote the second most of the book. It's called Catastrophe Now.
Fantastic. Well, man, again, thank you so much for coming on. It was enlightening. So, and like I said, I'd love to have you back on here and maybe a couple of months, right? Just because I think
Yeah,
the closer we get to the
absolutely.
election, I think the more we'll start seeing things shake apart, both at home and abroad. So definitely in a couple of months, I'd like
Yeah,
to have you back on.
let's do it again after the Trump sentencing, or maybe after the Republican National Convention, July.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Okay.
Awesome.
All
Thanks,
right.
David.
Thanks so much for having me on.
All right.
Thanks,
Bye,
David.
everybody.